My next guest is Hans Appel. Hans is the educator, a speaker, podcaster, and director of culture at Teach Better Team. He's also the co-creator of AW Culture, author of award-winning culture, and that's a perfect tool for building whole child intentionality and action through kindness, empathy, and service. Hans has worked as a counselor in the Richland School District for the past 19 years. 2 years ago, Hans launched his own blog about school culture and rolled out a student-led leadership podcast called Award-Winning Culture, hosted by Wildcat Nation. Welcome to the podcast, Hans.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
So we did a little bit of talk in the pre-chat about your book and how your experience as a school counselor has led you to start these Twitter chats and be active on social media with award-winning culture. So tell me a little bit about what led you to write your book.
Yeah, and thanks for asking that. That's kind of a long question. I guess I'll start by saying that I believe that education at its highest level is about inspiring others to discover and develop their joy.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that's what life is all about, right? Like living out your why,
Mm-hmm.
understanding your own unique strengths and passions and aligning those to some deeper meaning. Some people call that purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that when we take the time to intentionally craft an award-winning culture in our schools and classrooms and offices, we provide the opportunity to pursue joy. Now, our path to really figuring that out took a number of years. I'll just kind of start with my own path. I was your classic ACEs kid. So, child of divorce, abusive home. School really became my safe haven, right? My place I could go, I could be age appropriate and just not have to worry about solving complicated adult emotional problems.
Sure.
I could just sort of be a kid. And so I think from an early age, teachers, coaches, my friends, they became like family to me. So I think I really understood the impact that things like kindness and empathy really played in student lives. And so as I shifted in, to graduate school and kind of finding my way, my wife was an educator, Jennifer. And so she's actually a fourth generation educator. And, kind of linking up and getting involved with her family, I realized I wanted to get into a path of serving others, right? And specifically working with kids. And so we've actually had the chance to work together for a number of years in a middle school. I love middle school. It's the craziest time. There's so much happening hormonally. So it's just a blast. But we really started noticing that some of the things that we were doing about school culture and character development and leadership and SEL, some of the ways we were reaching the whole child was different than what was happening in other schools. And so we started having, originally it was just the companies of some of the programs we were using reaching out to us, wanting to know more about, hey, what's the secret sauce happening at Enterprise? Why are you having, so much success with attendance and discipline and grades and all these different, factors? And at the same time, we started getting questions by other leadership folks from around our area. So, we had principals and superintendents reaching out, wanting to come do site visits because they had heard about what was happening at Enterprise. And so me as the counselor, my wife as the leadership teacher at the time, had a pretty, big role in, what was happening as far as our school culture. And so people kind of were asking us these questions, and it really forced us to look internally to try to figure out, tease out kind of what is the secret thing that's happening in our building. And we kept coming back to these three big words of character, excellence, and community.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we, started to kind of write about it and speak about it and talk about it and explore it, it sort of surfaced this idea of, we've got something here that other schools need. And so that was really, I guess, the early stages of me going, okay, beyond speaking and doing some of the things, training wise with other educators, I need to write a book and I need to get this out into the world so that other educators can learn, some of the things that we've learned when it comes to school culture.
So how long was the time period between kind of coming to that conclusion that you wanted to share that information and then when the book was out and published?
Yeah. So, I would say I've been working on the book for about 2 years.
Mhm.
And before that, there was probably another 5 years where, we knew something different was happening at Enterprise. And so, kind of trying to tease that out and really uncover some of the secrets behind the success. Because the reality is, a lot of times you don't think about what you do, right?
Mhm.
You just do it, and you think this is normal. And it's not until you stop and reflect and kind of look inward that you go, okay, wait, what are we doing here? Let's. Is there some rationale or theory behind what's working?
Were there other team members involved besides you and your wife that were key in kind of coming up with what could be part of the book and kind of gathering those ideas over those 5 years before you started working on the book?
No, I would say the book is definitely our work. But as far as, being instrumental in what we were doing
Mhm.
school culture wise, 100%.
Yeah.
One of the things I write about in the book is, creating a team. And I call it a whole child team. But it's really having that all in mindset of,
Mhm.
I guess, being purposeful and intentional about how are we going to, on a school-wide basis, teach social emotional learning and character ed. And so we created a team at our school and had a number of folks involved with that really helped gather buy-in and really push that out into a successful rollout.
Mhm.
And so the team was definitely a huge instrumental part, but not about the book specifically.
Okay. So once you got the book started and created, your outline for the book, did it take a while to finish the book and get that published? What was that process like?
Yeah, so the process was weird for me. Most of the time, when you write a book, you write a little piece of the book, and then you do like the table of contents, and then you line up your publisher, and then you write the rest of the book. That's pretty standard like process for writing a book. So for me, I actually ended up. I talked to a few publishers, but I didn't really, go into too much detail. I just kind of wanted to learn a little bit about the process.
Hmm.
But I ended up writing the whole book before I ever pitched it
Wow.
to a publisher. So that was a little different. Um, and like I said, it took about 2 years. I mean, I poured my heart and soul into this book. So, it was, quite a undertaking to do. The crazy part is I went from having no offer, right? I had this book and I had just finished this book and then started talking to publishers to I had multiple offers
Hmm.
to when we ended up signing the contract with the publisher, we ended up signing a contract for a 3-book deal.
Wow.
So it's actually a series that we're putting together. So the first book is my book. It's kind of that school-wide lens.
Hmm.
Jen, my wife, is writing the second book, which is more specific to the teacher.
Hmm.
So it's taking that school-wide framework and then how do you like implement that within the classroom? And then the third book is kind of the wide angle, I guess, perspective of, okay, now let's go outside of the school. And,
Hmm.
how does this apply to families and parents and everybody else out in the community?
Okay. Have you started work on the third book?
No, we're still on the second book right now.
But you have an idea of what it's going to look like.
Yes, yes.
No, I definitely think that's a good way to, have that plan for that trilogy of a book because the parents want to know also, how do you have award-winning culture at the school,
Right.
right?
Absolutely.
Stakeholders, it's great to have that buy-in from the community as well. So
Very true.
since this podcast is called Out of the Trenches, do you have a particular story about when you were in the trenches, either growing up or during your educational career? And how did you crawl out of the trenches?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I certainly could talk about my childhood a lot, but I think I'll tell maybe a more interesting, relevant story to this topic. Um, this was probably maybe 10 years ago. We had a really rough spring where it felt like kids were out of control. We were having lots of like hallway ruckuses and fights and things like that. And there's one situation that really like was sort of the punctuation, I guess, of this, rough spring. We ended up having an altercation in a science classroom between a boy and a girl, where boys, basically the boy got frustrated with the girl. They were working on some sort of group project,
Mhm.
and he lunged at her and really started to like choke her and like, wanted to hurt her in a bad way. And it ended up taking a couple students and the teacher to kind of pull him off of her. It was a
Mhm.
really scary incident. Everybody was kind of traumatized. So all the office staff came down, principals, counselors, and the aftermath was really terrible because, he ended up getting expelled. The girl, the teacher, the entire class were just totally traumatized by the situation. Finding words to kind of comfort everybody in the room was
Right.
really challenging. And I found myself along with our principals, in a number of meetings the rest of that spring, um, that were kind of geared around, how are you going to keep our kids safe?
Mhm.
Because you're not doing a good job keeping our kids safe right now. And it really kind of brought me back to my why and my own childhood, and feeling like I had failed. And even beyond that, like, I think a lot of people in our school kind of felt like, we've hit rock bottom. Like, our
Mhm.
school is not safe right now.
Yeah.
And if it's not safe, there's no learning happening. Right. So that really, I would say, was the spearhead of starting to explore, how are we going to reach kids on a more holistic way. The crazy part about it is the boy and the girl were friends. So this wasn't a situation of, they had been fighting and picking at each other for years and finally had enough. Like,
Mhm.
by most accounts, they were probably best friends. But the boy had no ability to manage his emotions and regulate them.
Yeah.
The teacher was not some brand new, teacher. This was like a teacher that had really good rapport with kids, like good classroom management, all those, key things. She's, great person. But, the reality is, I realized, as much shame and like guilt as I was feeling about, not working with this student in a more proactive way, or, doing a better job, like, reaching every single student. I realized that at that time that, SEL and character development is not a one person job. It is not just up to one individual to try to pull that off. And so that's really when we started looking at things from a school wide lens.
Mhm.
And I think, I can say now, as hard as that time was, that really was what sort of propelled us towards an eventual award winning culture.
Yeah. So I mean, definitely, it took that time, and that's kind of what woke you up, right? That event, and
Yeah.
realizing, those meetings that you had with the principal in the spring, and realizing, we really got to change things.
Yeah.
That was a turning point, huh?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of times, you know, if anybody's had success, they can kind of look back and go, okay, that's when things started to pivot, right? We didn't do everything right, right away as far as what we were doing with the whole child. We started, though, to move from being reactive, and just kind of putting out fires, to let's get ahead of it and be
Mhm.
proactive, start teaching these skills. I would say it took us another few years before we really started getting intentional with what we were
Mhm.
doing. And that was like the whole nother level.
Yeah. Yeah. It does take a couple years to do a pivot of a school
Yes.
culture. So
Yes.
when
Yes.
you're hearing that kids didn't feel safe at school, to a place where, it's award winning culture, that, isn't something that happens over the period of a couple months. So I think you, as a counselor, must have a unique perspective into, how you've worked with culture at your school. A lot of my experience has been as a teacher and administrator, and I'd like to hear what your unique perspective as a counselor is, and how that's shaped when you're coaching other schools about how to build better school culture.
Yeah. And, so I've been in this profession 19 years, and, I hear a lot of people say that kids are kids, right?
Mhm.
And I feel like that's true to an extent,
Mhm.
but I also feel like kids have changed.
Mhm.
I don't feel like school and the students that I see are the same exact students that I saw at the beginning of my career.
Yeah.
And I think the research would support that. I think we're seeing like such elevated anxiety and stress. um, the research out there says that the average teen today has as much anxiety as the average psychiatric patient of the 1950s.
Wow.
In other words, most kids that are walking around right now, like, like they're overwhelmed, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I think anybody that's in a school like sees that every day. Like,
Mhm.
kids come to school stressed out. They are stressed at school, and there's a multitude of reasons for that, right? Probably social media plays a role in that. Probably mental health factors play a role in that. Different things going on at home, poverty, equity, all kinds of challenges that kids probably are dealing with that like I didn't have to deal with when I was at that age. But I think for me, so much of my time is spent on how can I make school safe, and
Mhm.
how can I make sure everyone feels connected. It doesn't have to be to me, but somebody right in the school. And how do we make sure that they're able to even be open to the possibility of learning?
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of times, we think in terms of like SEL and character as like another thing on the plate.
Mhm.
And what I've realized over the years is that is the plate. Like that is the thing that everything else rests on.
Yeah.
Like there is no learning, there is no joy, there is no anything else happening until we have these character and SEL skills in place. And that really is how we reach the whole child.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a mindset a lot of educators need to have. And we all know coming in from school shutdowns and when we come back
Yeah.
in the fall, we all know that that's going to be increased anxiety, increased trauma. And for us to think that it's just something extra we have to do, no.
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah.
comes first, right? That's what's
Yeah.
before bloom. And kind of in that same vein, how were you able to support your students as a counselor during the shutdown? How were you able to help them feel safe at home?
Yeah, and I think, part of it is I feel like that was challenging for me. I
Mhm.
feel like it took me a little while to sort of get my legs underneath me because it wasn't how I was used to being a counselor. I feel like even using that word counselor in a remote style feels weird because it certainly felt like a different role and job and delivery of the services that I normally would provide. So but I think, it was, just the constant connections, right? The
Mhm.
emails and the Zoom calls and the phone calls and just, trying to reach out to kids that you're worried about or that are at risk or that, just need that consistent check in. I will say this though, if anything, COVID really reinforced to me that relationships and school culture are so pivotal
Mhm.
because I feel like I can't imagine being a classroom teacher or a counselor or in any admin role and not having those things already lined up and then going into COVID. I
Mhm.
would imagine that was like debilitating, you know.
Yeah.
So I think we felt lucky that we kind of had like that baseline in place. So now that was in place, then it's easier to kind of make the connections live on, right?
Mhm.
So like I was just talking to somebody the other day and you know it was a lot of times we have these like rituals that we do, right?
Mhm.
Like things that you do with your students or that you do with certain kids or little like inside jokes. And I think one of the things that we figured out really early is even though they look a little bit different,
Yeah.
like we can still do those things remotely.
Mhm.
So I'll give you an example. We have a teacher that likes to use this cowbell, and anytime there's an aha moment in his class, he rings this giant, it's like big cowbell, and it's kind of this fun thing. Well, he realized he could go to school and get that and bring that home, right? And do that same thing, even though it had a little different spin. It was the same gist of it, right? And so I think that's the kind of stuff that I was looking for was how do I continue to do some of the rituals with students as a counselor that I continue or what I mean that I did before.
Mhm. Mhm. And for the most part in your school, would because of the culture, was there a lot of participation in those meetings that you had or other class meetings? Maybe do you ever like go into classes and give talks? Did you do that during the remote period?
No, I did not attend any of the classes that were going on.
Mhm.
So I wasn't involved with those. We had pretty good participation, I would say, in the classes. It was one of those things that I think it started less participation, and it kind of like, as people kind of got comfortable with it,
Yeah.
and technology got, sorted out and things like that, I think we saw like more and more participation go as we went. I
Mhm.
think there was, kind of a learning curve for a lot of teachers, and getting used to doing the video Zoom kind of stuff. I was fortunate because we were already using this kind of technology with our student-led podcast.
Oh, okay.
So for me, and for even for my wife, it was like comfortable to be able to do that kind of stuff. So we were able to connect with kids really early. But I know there was teachers that, that was a little bit harder learning curve for.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. But yeah, it's good when you had a group of students who are already taking the reins and kind of had that being used to doing something virtually. So
Yes.
they were able to continue with that.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about, is from your perspective as a counselor, how the use of social media tools have changed, either for the better or for worse in your school setting.
So I feel like it's like this little like curve. Like
Yeah.
there was no social media, no phones, when I started my career. And then all of a sudden they like were there, and,
Yeah.
it was like everywhere. And then it was like a problem. Like no one knew what to do with, phones and classrooms and things like that. And now we've kind of come full circle where now phones are really, and social media is really, um, we see it as a positive, and we actually use it as a positive in our schools. So I'll give you one example. Like we have students that run something that we call our Human Wildcats, which is basically like an Instagram account where they go out and they do interviews and photos and videos and stuff that are things that are character related. So they would might go out and ask questions about, hey, who's somebody that's inspired you and why? Or, what does the word selflessness mean to you? Or, things like that. And so I think, you know, sort of modeling that, we've got a number of teachers and people that are on social media and are learning how to like post and do things in real time at school. So modeling that and then putting students in the position and empowering them to be able to be a part of that.
Mhm.
We've had a number of students with our student-led podcast that have been directly involved with, all of the sharing out of the podcast and blogs and videos and things that are associated with that. So I think that's been a real positive. We've also, as part of some of the things that we do with school culture, we've intentionally taught digital citizenship and internet safety and some of those kinds of things in our health classes.
Okay.
And so I think that's been a real beneficial as well. Like I, I feel like at first with phones, they were just like there and like nobody knew exactly what to do with them. But
Mhm.
what we've realized is if we can be intentional and really like teach, the right behaviors and then kind of step back and allow students the opportunity to take the reins, to
Mhm.
use your words, then it's really taken off and been a big success.
Yeah, so it seems like what you're experiencing is that the kids are using it to their advantage. They're using it positively, and and you're not really seeing any issues with like behaviors or maybe bullying, cyberbullying going on.
I would say far less than most schools. We see a little bit every once in a while. Things pop up. I mean, I don't think any school is immune
Yeah.
to little things that happen, but it's far less than what my colleagues talk about in terms of the cyberbullying and things like that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great to hear because, yeah, if you have a objective for those kids, using the social media in that human wildcats context, for example, then
Yeah.
they'll run with it, right? Because they
Yes,
like to post videos, they
they
like to
do.
they like to make movies and interview other kids. So
That no, it's funny that you say that. We had a leadership class a few years ago, and there was a student in there didn't want to take leadership, like
mhm.
didn't show any signs of like wanting to be a positive leader, kind of thing. And the teacher kind of figured out, okay, this is a student that has like a lot of skills at creating videos and really
Uh-huh.
likes to create videos, and she ended up putting him in kind of a special role where he got to to do some really cool, like inspirational kind of videos and things. And he just ran with it. And it was just like such a strength. And it was interesting because it was a student that really struggled in a lot of his other classes, like academically and just motivationally and even behaviorally a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing him in that role and where he kind of had his niche, like, this is what I'm good at. I'm the rock star video maker in the class. It was fun to see him just kind of come to life. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, I think you're right. I think sometimes it's about, finding, that right spot for a kid to flourish. Right.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I think a lot of educators recognized that during the shutdown of schools, because kids were able to do more project-based learning activities and take, learning into their own hands. My
Mm-hmm.
sixth grade son built a fort, and a lot of these, type things that you, with household items, things that you could
Yep.
do at home. And I think kids that were otherwise quiet in the classroom probably found a lot of creative ways to complete assignments
Mm-hmm.
they otherwise wouldn't have
Absolutely.
done. What would you tell a school leader at the high school level who isn't sure of how to implement more social emotional learning? If they're the leader of a large school and they realize that that's something that's important, that's missing at their school, what would you tell that leader?
So first off, buy my book, Award-Winning Culture. I mean, my book basically lays out exactly what I would tell to somebody. It is like a step-by-step, like there's tons of, stories, but also practical advice and ideas and strategies. It really is about building a strong foundational why.
Mm-hmm.
So that starts with a staff why. I always recommend one whole year to implement an effective SEL character program.
Mm-hmm.
So, that really starts with pieces like training and figuring out all the school-wide like rollout of this, having a clear vision and being able to articulate that vision to that staff. But really tying everything that you're doing with an SEL lessons or character development back to every other part of your school. So in the book, I lay out, what should morning announcements look like? What should assemblies look like? What should parent teacher conferences look like? I mean, everything that relates back to that character work. So I guess the short answer would be time, really take your time, do your homework, think it through, build your team, and train up your team over that extended period of time. And that's probably the number one question we get from leaders is, how do you get buy-in? Because
Mm-hmm.
realistically, Dana, we were probably at about 98% buy-in, which is unheard of. I mean, there's a lot of people that say they want to do SEL, but then they want someone else to do the SEL work,
Yeah.
right? Um, and so like we had a lot of school leaders going, how did you do that? And that is exactly what I laid out in the book. But it really starts with that time piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for them not to expect it's just going to change overnight, right?
Yep.
They have to
Yep.
keep working on it, and they have to have their goals, and they can check back every few months or every once a semester and see kind of if they've achieved the goal for that semester, right? Break it up
Mm-hmm.
in small chunks.
Absolutely.
So, out of our conversation today, what's the most important thing that you like listeners to remember?
Hmm. I think listeners, I would hope that what they hear is that, academic content is really just a vehicle to teach kids what matters most, which
Mm-hmm.
is character, excellence, and community. The research suggests that if we only focus on academics, then we're only giving students 30 to 50% of what they need to be
Mm-hmm.
successful after high school. So that's failure, and if you start talking to companies and colleges and people that are out in the community, they reiterate the same thing. Like for the most part, they can teach the content skills for a job or whatnot. But it's all of those other pieces, those soft skills that people started calling them. That's everything. That's really the key to having success in family, work, church, whatever. That's where it all begins. And so focusing on that first, getting that, in place will pay such huge dividends with academics.
No, I think that's a great point to end on. And I think most of us are realizing that now with having, done the remote learning and seeing how the relationships are where we should focus, especially going in next school year to an uncertain future and building those relationships with new kids. So
Yeah.
I thank you so much for being a part of the Out of the Trenches podcast. If listeners want to reach out to you, where can they find you?
Yeah, so probably the easiest way is on my website, which is awardwinningculture.com. All the information about speaking and training and some of the coaching that we're doing, as well as the books that are coming out, are all there. And then the best way to reach me, I'm on both Twitter and Instagram, and my handle is Hans N. Appel. And you spell Apple a little weird. It's Appel. But that's probably the easiest place to get me on Twitter and Instagram.
Well, thank you so much. It was great talking to you today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Bye.